If hearing aids cost thousands of dollars, why do some cost $1,000 while others cost $7,000 or more? And more importantly, what are you actually paying for? Because once people start researching hearing aids, things get confusing very quickly. Suddenly you see online companies, Costco, private practice, over-the-counter devices, insurance programs, premium technology, AI hearing aids, subscription models. And honestly, a lot of people start wondering, am I about to get ripped off? And I understand why. Because from the outside, hearing aid pricing often absolutely makes no sense, especially when two hearing aids can look nearly identical while costing thousands of dollars apart. And this is where a lot of people make one of the biggest mistakes I see. They become so focused on price tag that they accidentally ignore the things that often determine whether hearing aids succeed in the long term. And most people don't realize what they're giving up until after they've already spent money. But spending less is not automatically a mistake. In fact, many people can save significant amounts of money and still do extremely well. But spending less in the wrong areas can become very expensive later, because the goal is not to buy the cheapest hearing aids possible. The goal is to make the smartest long-term decision for the way that you hear. Why hearing aid pricing feels so confusing. One reason hearing aid pricing feels so frustrating is because people assume they're only buying a device, but in reality, what people often don't realize is that hearing aid pricing often includes testing, programming, follow-up care, verification, adjustments, warranties, ongoing support, and much more. And sometimes those hidden differences become extremely important later. And this is where confusion starts, because two clinics may quote completely different prices while offering completely different levels of care. But to the patient, it may just look like one place is charging thousands more. Sometimes that higher price genuinely is unnecessary, but other times, the cheaper option quietly removes some of the exact things that determine whether hearing aids succeed long term. And many people do not realize this until they start struggling. Because hearing aids are not like buying headphones, they interact with your hearing loss, your brain, speech processing, background noise, your ear anatomy, your tolerance for sound, and your daily environments. That's much more complicated than most people initially expect. And this is why I see people become disappointed after chasing the best deal. Because sometimes the deal was only cheaper because critical support disappeared. Where people often waste money. At the same time, I also think some people spend more than they actually need to. And this is important to talk about honestly, because not every person needs the most expensive hearing aids available. I see this misconception constantly. People assume premium automatically means better, but hearing is more individualized than that. For some people, advanced premium technology absolutely makes a major difference. Especially complex listening environments, restaurants, group conversations, challenging noise situations. But for other people, the real-world improvement between mid-level and premium technology may be much smaller than expected. And this is where people get confused, because hearing aid marketing often creates the impression that more expensive equals dramatically better hearing. But sometimes the improvement is subtle. And if someone mostly lives in quiet environments, smaller conversations, simpler listening situations, they may not benefit nearly as much from top-tier technology. I think this is one reason some people later feel disappointed, not because the hearing aids were bad, but because expectations became unrealistic. And this is where I think honest counseling matters tremendously, because the goal should not be sell the most expensive device. It should be match the technology realistically to the person's lifestyle. And I think many people are afraid to ask these questions because hearing aid pricing feels intimidating. But they should ask, because sometimes spending slightly less makes complete sense. Where cheap decisions become dangerous. Now we need to talk about the other side of this, because there are areas where trying to save money can create major long-term frustration. This is where I see many people unintentionally sabotage their results, especially when people choose hearing aids based almost entirely on price, convenience, or advertising claims. One of the biggest examples, skipping proper fitting and verification. And this is something most people researching hearing aids online barely hear about, because the conversation becomes brand, price, AI, Bluetooth, rechargeable batteries, while some of the most important parts get ignored completely. I've seen people wearing very expensive hearing aids, programmed terribly, and I've seen people wearing more affordable hearing aids perform surprisingly well because they were fit properly. That matters enormously. Because hearing aids are not magic, they must be programmed correctly for your hearing loss. And this is where people often get misled by same manufacturer or same hearing aid for less. Because even if the hardware is identical, the outcome may not be. This is one of the biggest hidden truths in hearing healthcare. The quality of the fitting often matters far more than people realize, especially in noise. Sometimes it's not even major programming changes that determine whether people succeed long term. Sometimes it's simple things: a clogged wax trap, a weak receiver, a broken wire, discomfort from a dome, moisture problems, or a hearing aid suddenly sounding softer on one side. And when getting those issues fixed becomes difficult, slow, expensive, or inconvenient, many people gradually stop wearing their hearing aids consistently. This is where many people accidentally create long-term problems, trying to save money up front. Because when hearing aids are not optimized properly, people become discouraged. And this is where some people slowly stop participating socially the way they used to. Then they wear them less. Speech clarity worsens. The brain struggles more in noise. Communication fatigue increases. Withdrawal increases. And eventually many people conclude hearing aids just don't work, when sometimes the issue was never the technology itself. The biggest mistake people make. The biggest mistake I see, people trying to optimize only for upfront cost, instead of optimizing for long-term communication success. And those are not always the same thing, because hearing aids are not a one-time purchase emotionally. They affect relationships, confidence, fatigue, social connection, independence, participation in life. And many people underestimate how emotionally exhausting unclear hearing becomes over time, especially in noise. This is why I often tell patients the cheapest hearing aids are not always the least expensive decision long term, because if hearing aids end up sitting in a drawer, that money solved nothing. And this is exactly what happens for many people, not because they were irresponsible, not because they were foolish, but because they were trying to avoid making a costly mistake and accidentally focused on the wrong variables. I see this pattern constantly. People obsess over what's the cheapest option, when the better question is often, what gives me the highest chance of actually succeeding with hearing aids? That is a completely different question, and usually a much smarter one. How to actually pay less the smart way. Now, with all that said, there absolutely are smart ways to lower hearing aid costs, and this is where I think people need more balanced guidance, because sometimes people think the only options are buy the cheapest thing online or spend $8,000, and reality is usually much more nuanced than that. For example, many people do extremely well with mid-level technology instead of premium. Some people genuinely do well with warehouse providers like Costco, but other people strongly benefit from more individualized fitting, troubleshooting, follow-up care, and long-term support. Some people can also use their insurance benefits strategically, which allows them to work with a provider or audiology practice that offers more individualized fitting, easier troubleshooting, and stronger long-term follow-up support at a lower cost. The key is understanding what you are sacrificing when making decisions and whether that sacrifice actually matters for your life. That's the important part, not what's cheapest, but what trade-offs am I making? Because some trade-offs are minor and some trade-offs affect communication every single day. That distinction matters enormously. I think people make much better decisions once they stop viewing hearing aids as a gadget purchase and start viewing them as a communication system, because communication affects almost every part of life. If you're currently researching hearing aids or worried about making an expensive mistake, don't assume the answer is automatically buy the cheapest option or buy the most expensive option, because the smartest decision is usually much more individualized than that. I think many people end up frustrated because no one fully explains what actually matters, what doesn't matter, and where cutting corners becomes risky. Because sometimes spending less is completely reasonable, but sometimes the wrong shortcut quietly creates years of communication frustration. And I see both situations all the time. If you found this helpful, be sure to subscribe to help support more content like this. Thanks for watching.